Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It had a little technical problems. I think we've fixed it. We have Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council, by phone. So, Aaron, I'll just repeat what I had asked you up front. One of the most articulated or radical policies that we've heard out of the Trump administration is the deportation of up to 11 million people. It is that policy sounds more real when you realize that Stephen Miller is now a chief policy advisor for Donald Trump, or will be in the Trump administration. Tom Homan, the border czar, and maybe you can explain to us what that is in the Trump administration. Kristi Noem will be the chief of the Department of Homeland Security. How real is this prospect of deporting 11 million people?
Well, to start with the idea of 11 million, it's extremely unrealistic that any presidential administration, no matter how harsh they wanted, could deport 11 million people in 4 years, because that number is just so high. We're talking nearly 4% of the entire U.S. population. And the logistics involved with any kind of operation to round up, arrest, detain, process, and remove 11 million people is so enormous that it's almost inconceivable. We're talking costs in the hundreds of billions of dollars to actually carry out. That is not to say that the administration that is coming in right now cannot significantly ramp up immigration enforcement and make it far more indiscriminate than it is today, all of which will likely bring up overall deportation numbers quite a lot. But 11 million is probably more along the lines of public relations than it is an actual plan for the next 4 years.
Okay. And we should say, just, for context, there was an operation called Operation Wetback during the Eisenhower years. I think it was in 1950. I can't remember exactly, but supposedly it involved 1.3 million. But I think historians would argue that it was probably closer to a quarter of that, of people who were deported. And that took, huge resources over the course of an extended period of time. And I imagine also that was, a function of having a lot of vets coming back from the war. And but what are they going to do? I mean, how is this going to play out? If they're not going to do 11 million, what will they do?
Yeah, and in going back to Operation Wetback really quickly, this is the major operation which President Trump has been citing as his inspiration for the deportations that he promises in this term. But crucially, the majority of people who were caught up in that operation left on their own out of fear. And the actual number of deportations was far more limited. Not only that, many people immediately came back because the border was a lot more porous 70 years ago than it is today. So the actual impact, a lot of historians believe, of the operation was pretty minimal. Within a few years, the numbers of undocumented immigrants in the country were largely the same. So what is the key difference today? Well, today we have a massive expansion of the immigration enforcement system across the United States, not just at the U.S.-Mexico border. Surveillance systems built up, and the ability of ICE to find people through the use of private tools like Clearview AI, license plate reader data, Lexis data, and individualized personal data that makes it easier for the government to find people than at any point before in U.S. history. So there will be an increase in the populations targeted. They're going to go after the so-called easy cases first and round up anyone who's nearby using so-called collateral arrests, What that might look like, for example, is a team of ICE agents that gets sent to a house, and rather than arresting just the one single target there, they force every person in the house to show their papers and arrest anybody who else is undocumented there. And we saw similar practices during the first Trump administration, and we expect these to be expanded significantly in the next one.
Who are, when they go to that house, I get the idea that they're just going to try and arrest everybody around this person. But how do they assess who that first person's going to be? I mean, my understanding is like during the Obama administration, which deported a tremendous amount of people, their first order of deportation was people with any type of like criminal record. How does it work? How will it work under the Trump administration, and how did it work under the Biden administration?
Yeah, so when we look at the Trump administration's promises, the one thing they are now coalescing around is we are maybe not going to do mass raids. We're going to go after the criminals first. But the thing is, ICE has already been focusing on people with criminal convictions, and that was the key policy of President Obama in his second term, so-called felons, not families. And what we saw in the first term is they abandoned that concept of prioritization and said there are no priorities. Everyone is a priority. But what that means in practice is that you actually start ending up arresting more people without criminal records, because if you're not prioritizing only those with the most serious offenses, you start picking up people for garden variety immigration offenses, including people with no criminal record whatsoever. But as this question about how do they find those people, in the 20 years since 9/11, we have seen ICE integrated into nearly every federal law enforcement database. So ICE gets new targets when state, local, or federal law enforcement fingerprint somebody, and it's run through the NCIC, the National Criminal Information Center. They have a couple of other databases that are constantly running and being queried by local law enforcement whenever somebody comes into custody. So it is fundamentally a target-based system, and I think this is really crucial for people to understand. ICE has never had a system to go out into the community and find people that are not already on their radar. And if the Trump administration wanted to round up all the undocumented immigrants, they would have to create a system to do that, which would look like indiscriminate enforcement and not the target-based kind of system that Tom Homan so far has promised. So we really have a tension in what the campaign has said. On the one hand, you have Stephen Miller promising to round up every, quote, illegal alien in the entire country, all 11 million. And then you have people like Tom Homan, who have much more experience on the ground, saying, no, these are just going to be targeted operations. And, which of those two wins that battle remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, how does... if Homan doesn't get the numbers that he wants, I mean, are there the numbers there that the administration and the campaign has promised? I mean, there is like I can't help but think if they haven't deported X number of people in the first 6 months, there's going to be pressure, right? I mean, somebody, it's going to be some senator, it's going to be some House member, maybe it's Stephen Miller, are going to be like, we need to do more. So is there enough people with Homan's pre-existing apparatus to satiate them, do you think?
I don't think so, because right now, there are a number of very key bottlenecks in the system, and the biggest one is the immigration courts. There are 3.7 million cases pending in the immigration courts right now, 3.7 million. There are 735 judges total hearing those cases. It's about 5,000 cases per judge on average. And these delays take years. And the way our legal system works for immigration court is that if a person gets picked up for the first time, generally speaking, it is picked up in the interior in particular, not applying to migrants at the border, but people picked up in the interior generally have to go through immigration court. So anyone arrested on January 22nd, if they've never been deported before, may not see a judge for 6 months to a year, and they might not get a final hearing on their case until after Trump has left office again. And not to mention, we are still on a continuing resolution using fiscal year 2024 funding, and talk is that Congress isn't going to actually pass a fiscal 25 funding bill until 2025. It's not until March of 2025. So it might be 2 months into the administration before they even get the money to start the process of ramping up capacity. Now, yes, they can pull funds from other parts of DHS, but in order to ramp up the capacity we're talking billions of dollars, and it's not clear if they have that money without Congress. So there's a real possibility that we see a frustrated President Trump, a year from now saying, why aren't these numbers higher? And I think remind people that there were 5 separate secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security in Trump's first term in office, in part because he frequently got frustrated with people who would tell him things like, no, actually, we can't just flip a switch and turn migration off overnight.
So with all of that, I mean, is there any way for them to short circuit that process? In other words, can they say, I guess maybe there would be a statutory change, like that if there is reason to suspect that you're undocumented and you're in this country, then you don't get a trial.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, that is a real concern because right now, everything that I've been saying presumes that there are not major changes to the law by Congress. I think if the filibuster holds, which is still an open question, it would be unlikely for major changes to get through Congress, but there is reconciliation. There are potential avenues for deals with Democrats, potentially some sort of harsher enforcement for Dreamers that could potentially change the way the system works. Then, however, you would still have issues with costs for detention, arrests, and some issues around actually removing people to countries that won't take them. But there's 2 other ways that the administration can beef up numbers. One is their plan for the so-called Alien Enemies Act, a wartime authority that it's last used during World War II for some internment of Japanese, Italian, and German non-citizens. And the Alien Enemies Act short-circuits the immigration court system. It's entirely separate, and essentially the U.S. government orders you to leave, and you have a reasonable period of time to get your affairs in order, then you have to go. So that's one option, though I think that faces significant challenges in court. The other is that there's actually hundreds of thousands of people in the country who have already been through the immigration court process and have already been ordered deported. There's 1.3 million in total. It's unclear how many of these are people the U.S. government knows where they are. Many are people who simply missed court years ago. But there are others who are checking in with ICE right now. They have stays of removal. They've been allowed to stay for the time being. And ICE is going to start revoking those immediately. And in this situation, they can tell people to come check in, arrest them at a check-in, and have them on a plane 48 hours later. So we saw this the first time around, and they're going to do it again the second time.
That's sort of the low-hanging fruit. That's when they were, I guess, hanging outside of courthouses. If a woman came in and reported a domestic abuse or something, the woman was subject to being deported, that type of thing.
Yeah, they will go after the easiest cases, which are people who really have no option for staying in the United States because they've got serious criminal records, which is not a large number of people. And the other option is going to be those people who've been ordered removed already because they don't have to be put through the court process again. And a lot of lawsuits in the first Trump term slowed that process down, but eventually, years in, produced some pretty negative precedent on the ability of the courts to stop the admin from doing that. So the courts will not be as helpful this time around, and they will be able to go after these easy cases first and ramp up those numbers.
Aaron, is there sometimes, and this is sort of like tangential, but is there sometimes a hesitation to bring these cases to the courts, particularly with the judicial environment we have now, because it does allow them to create precedents? Like, it's as if, Trump's first term now has essentially greased all the wheels and eliminated all the points of friction that existed in the first term.
Yeah, so I got my start working in impact litigation for immigration. And, this is something that litigators think about all the time. Should you bring this case? And sometimes the answer is no. But when you have an administration like we're going to have, sometimes there is no other option. Even if you think you might produce bad precedent, just even bringing the lawsuit may buy time. And I think this is something we're going to see a lot in this next term. We're going to see people bringing cases. We're going to see in liberal district court judges in California or New York or Maryland halting some policies, liberal circuit courts in the Second Circuit or the Fourth Circuit or the Ninth Circuit, putting stays on these. And then it's going to go up to the Supreme Court a lot on emergency requests, and we will see which ones they step in on and which ones they don't. But eventually, those will reach decisions. It's just maybe going to slow things down for a year or two. The other really crucial thing, though, to understand about this term is that in 2022, the Supreme Court issued a decision saying that federal judges, thanks to a 1996 law, cannot enter any broad injunctions against immigration enforcement policies. In fact, the only option to halt even blatantly unlawful enforcement policies is through filing something known as an Administrative Procedure Act lawsuit, which is much slower. And so this 96 law is going to put us in a place where getting the kind of court orders blocking Trump policies that we got last time around are not going to be as easy and will be a lot slower, even setting aside that the conservative judiciary or the judiciary is more conservative now.
I want to start going through what people can do, both like on an individual level within their community, but also the other points of potential friction. And let's start from further away and get closer to home. One of the areas of friction would be whether Mexico or any other Central American country, or let's say China in certain instances, or perhaps, African country or whomever, wherever people are coming from, and that these countries refuse to take people back or take people who are not citizens of their country. That's one sort of way in which the deportations could slow, yes?
Yeah, and it's an incredibly important one, and specifically because of Venezuela, a country which hasn't accepted U.S. deportations for years, with a minor exception for a few months earlier this year, where the Biden administration reached a deal with Maduro to lift some sanctions in exchange for them taking deportation flights, which halted as soon as they started messing around with the election there. So President Trump has said, he's going to do Operation Aurora and round up Venezuelan Tren de Aragua members and deport them all back to Venezuela. Well, the problem with that is Venezuela isn't going to take those flights, and we are already sanctioning Venezuela, and new sanctions are not going to change their minds on that. So unless the Trump administration actually lifts sanctions on Venezuela, they will find it very hard to deport anyone from Venezuela there, which as of now, there's over 600,000 Venezuelans who've crossed the border since in the last 4 years. And virtually none of them can be deported to Venezuela, just as for 50 years, Cubans couldn't be deported to Cuba. And this really emphasizes a point that the Trump people don't like talking about, which is that deportations are bilateral. They are diplomatic acts. They're not just an act of force by the United States on the undesirable. They are a choice by the receiving country as well to take that person back.
And so, there's a weird predicament where, if I wanted to put pressure on the Trump administration, say, I would be highly critical of them to roll back sanctions on Venezuela, if I wanted to inhibit their ability to deport people, of course, I also may not be in favor of sanctions on Venezuela. But that's the sort of like political dilemma that they face and that folks like I would face.
Yeah, and I think this is something that many countries around the world understand as a point of leverage for the United States, over the United States. If you are Venezuela, if you're Nicaragua, if you're Cambodia, China, or one of the several so-called recalcitrant countries, migration is one of the few things that you can control entirely outside of the United States. If the U.S. wants to deport your own citizens back to your country and you are at odds with the United States, it is one of the few things that is within your control as a sovereign nation to simply say no to. And that means that we've seen some countries around the world weaponize migration. In Russia, there is reports that the Putin regime has been sending migrants through to Norway in order to impose some strains there. We've seen similar things around the world. Nicaragua has been a main hub for migrants coming to the United States because they understand that this is something that they can attempt to use as diplomatic leverage. And Mexico, in particular, has more power over the United States than it maybe has ever had because of the blockade on migrants that it is currently undergoing and the agreements it's made with the Biden administration to take some people from countries other than Mexico. If President Trump comes into office and immediately adopts a hostile attitude towards Mexico, Mexico could just take its foot off the brakes and say to migrants, all right, we're not going to get in your way. And suddenly Trump would be dealing with a large-scale border crisis.
Right. Okay. So in the event, though, that they can't, the Trump administration can't negotiate and get, and this leverage is being used, then what happens? We could have massive camps, right? I mean, I know that like private prison, I mean, I've been hearing this for over a decade that private prison corporations were saying at least 10 years ago, prior to Trump, that their future is in basically imprisoning immigrants as opposed to U.S. born citizens, I guess. Is that like in the event that they cannot make those deals to deport these people on the other end, are we going to be looking at massive, like essentially concentration camps?
Yeah, the next 4 years are going to be a bonanza for private prison companies and for contractors in general that deal with private prisons and transportation of people in detention. Geo Group stocks have skyrocketed, CoreCivic stocks have skyrocketed, and we are seeing Geo Group say they want to potentially double their capacity right now. So yes, we're going to see a very significant increase in detention. But on scale here, I think it's important for people to realize the Trump administration is going to weaponize fear here, and they're going to weaponize public relations around raids. I think we're going to see a lot of cases in the first 6 months or so where ICE carries out a pretty standard operation, the kind of things that they do all the time. And rather than a small press release coming out from the ICE Public Affairs Office, we're going to see the White House blast out media images of raids on these towns and in small communities and say, we've picked up 400 people, even if that's a pretty standard number for a large-scale, national operation. And the idea there is to send people into the shadows and get them to self-deport. You've seen Tom Homan already start doing this, saying, to the media that undocumented immigrants should just leave the country right now. And the entire right is going to lean on this fear, and more fear, with the hope that people go home on their own because it might be too difficult for the government to actually do that in the next few years. But for detention camps, legally speaking, once somebody has been ordered deported, if they can't be deported because, for example, their country says no, the U.S. is only allowed to hold them for 6 months. But the U.S. can hold people indefinitely before an immigration court hearing. And we may see more and more people held in these camps, potentially tens of thousands of people at a time being held awaiting hearings, which is going to be a big deal, especially when they start rounding up families and throwing families into detention centers, which are going to reopen probably within the first 6 months.
To deal with that fear, or to deal, I mean, getting a little bit closer now, like what, and I imagine states could say, like, we're not going to have one of these detention centers here. I don't know that they would. But what
I think a lot will, actually. In blue states, there has been enormous local organizing to prevent state and local governments from hosting ICE. And in New York City, for example, when I was practicing as an immigration lawyer in New York City 10 years ago, there were 3 major detention centers within the area. They are all, or most of them are not operating anymore, thanks to local campaigns. So that's something that local advocates can do, is sort of push for blue states and blue local communities not to rent out their local jails to ICE, because ICE is going to need those beds.
What else can we do?
The other things that people can do is volunteer for local organizations. We're going to see a return to the need for accompaniment. This became a big deal the first time around when ICE would call people in for check-ins. If 40 people and an archbishop show up, maybe ICE changes their mind. This is the famous activist Robbie Rogbier in New York City, literally had bishops showing up to support him and come with him into his check-in, and city council people come to his check-in to support him, and it made a difference. The media was paying attention, and ICE balked. And though there was also litigation involved. So that is going to be helpful. I think it's also important for people not to spread fear on this. Try to verify information before things happen. There's going to be rumors being spread about ICE raids. Oftentimes these aren't going to be true. It might just be a standard ICE arrest of one person, and sending around the message that ICE is doing a large-scale raid might cause people not to go to school or work, or to pull their kids out, from daycare if they're worried about it. So verify your information, make sure things are actually happening, look for trusted sources, and support immigrants and immigrant rights organizations, because we are all going to need it.
Lastly, temporary protected status and separately DACA. What are the chances? I mean, what would you tell someone if they're here on temporary protected status, like a lot of Haitian population, and I think Venezuelans are here on that TPS program, or DACA? What would you tell those people?
Yeah, this is a population I'm very worried about, and in some ways very vulnerable, not necessarily to deportation, but to losing their status, losing their jobs, and losing their protections. By the time Trump takes office, there will be at least 1.5 million people who have temporary protected status or DACA combined. Every one of those people is at risk of having their status expire or be terminated by the time Trump leaves office in his first term. When that is going to happen may vary between populations. Last time around, they waited for TPS to expire before terminating it, and they gave people with DACA one final renewal. So, we may not be looking at the expirations beginning until 2026 or 2027, but realistically speaking, that is a huge population, 1.5 million, that may all lose their work authorization and their protections against deportation, which is going to have profound impacts on them, their family members, and their communities. And we are going to be fighting as hard as we can in the court to stop that, but it is going to be a tough battle. One thing the Biden administration can do, I will say on this, is they need to be extending TPS designations now. They have 2 months left. People need to be calling the White House. People need to be calling DHS and telling them, there are 10 TPS designations that expire in Trump's first month, covering 650,000 people, 180,000 Salvadorans, over 350,000 Venezuelans, 50,000 Ukrainians, thousands of Afghanistans, 50+ thousand Hondurans. All of those countries, their designations expire before July, by July of next year. So the Biden administration can go ahead and grant an additional extension right now, which will stave things off for at least another year, and they should be working urgently on this now.
Why wouldn't they do that? I mean,
that's a question for them, and something that we should be urging them to do. Yep. And if they say, "Well, we just don't have the time," tell them work late.
If we want to urge, like how? Like if I were to tell, if you were to tell me right now, go urge. I mean, aside from the fact that, I can do it on this show, but would I call the White House? Would I call my senator? I mean, what would you recommend I do?
I think, calling members of Congress and urging them to urge the White House and DHS to do this is good. Calling DHS as well. We've got at the American Immigration Council, the Immigrant Justice Campaign. We've got volunteer opportunities and ways for people to send messages to the White House on issues like this. So I encourage people to check that out. It's the Immigration Justice Campaign, also linked from our website. But yes, contact your member, contact the White House, let them know that in the 2 months they have left, they better be doing something.
All right. We are going to put a link to the American Immigration Council. People can find resources there. And Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, I suspect we'll be talking again soon because this is going to be, I think, sort of one of the central elements of the many things that the Trump administration is going to bring that's going to make our stomachs turn. This is going to be one of the big ones. So really appreciate your taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.